Over to you.
Am I audible? Hello? Am I audible? Okay, thank you. So, welcome to the third and the final day of Confluence 2020, an international web lecture series, a 3-day web lecture series that has been organized by the Department of English, Piyush Kanti Mukherjee, Mahavidyalaya, Alipurduar. For the last couple of days, we have heard amazing lectures, words of scholarship that were truly invigorating and intellectually stimulating. And today we are back with two most amazing academicians, Dr. Shorit Bhattacharya and Dr. Orko Chattopadhyay with us. So without much further ado, let me just get on with this presentation. But before that, I have a small announcement to make. Here at my place, we are experiencing heavy rainfall. So there may be certain, this makes the network so temperamental. So I hope you'll all understand the plight and will bear with us. So without much further ado, let me introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Bhattacharya, to you all. So now, Shorit Bhattacharya is it's really a great honor for a college of Alipurduar to host him, actually, because he is a native of that place and a student of McWilliam High School, and he's an amazing teacher. And so with these words, I'll introduce him. His areas of interest, research interest, include post-colonial literatures, eco-criticism, translation studies, Marxism, and literary form. His works in these areas are either published or forthcoming in such journals as Ariel, Textual Practice, Interventions, Irish University Review, and in edited books such as Cambridge Critical Concepts, Magic Realism, The Aesthetics, and The Politics of Global Hunger, and others. His first monograph, titled Post-Colonial Modernity and the Indian Novel on Catastrophic Realism, was published by Palgrave in June 2020. His co-edited volume with Orko Chattopadhyay and Shamrat Sengupta on the radical Bengali writer Nabarun Bhattacharya will be published by Bloomsbury in September 2020. Shorit is a co-founding editor of Shongla. So he currently is working at the University of Glasgow as a lecturer in post-colonial studies. And today he'll be talking on museums and colonialisms, reading Leila Abu Leila. Over to you, Shorit sir.
Thank you so much. Purva, can you hear me? I think your voice got frozen.
Yes,
so
I
yeah, yes, you can hear me, right? Okay, all right, that's great.
Yes,
so yes, thank you.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me today, for having me at Piyush Kanti Mahavidyalaya at Alipurduar. It feels a bit odd, frankly, to be able to be sort of delivering a lecture at Alipurduar and yet be based elsewhere. I mean, of course, like it would have been excellent to be able to go and deliver it there. But of course, we know not everything could be possible. And for this crisis, in a different sense of the term, of course, like this, at least this online lecture could be made. So my thanks to Purva and to Piyush Kanti Mahavidyalaya and to all of your speakers. These are weekdays here in the UK, so I've not been able to always tune in and listen to everyone, but I'm sure like some of these talks or probably all of them will be on YouTube or some other ways of holding them. So I'm definitely going to be going back to them as it becomes like sort of, a lesser sort of tiresome in this part, especially during weekdays. So I'll not take much time sort of about what I'm going to be talking about. Let's get straight to the slides, if possible. So my talk today is, as Purva already mentioned, that it is about museums and colonialism. Now, museums and colonialism are topics which are being widely discussed, let's say, in the UK at least, and especially in Europe, about how museums have been able to implement over centuries a particular ideology, an ideology of racism, an ideology of colonialism that overall was part of the discourse, a national discourse of racism and sort of colonialism or imperialism. So now with the post-colonial sort of tenor, now that with the last few years, especially in the UK, where I was doing my PhD a few years back, I could see that a few events, especially Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford or decolonizing the university, etc. Some of these events, along with some of the statue debates and monument debates, were shaping the further debates about how museums for centuries have helped or rather promoted an understanding of imperialism, or rather a discourse of imperialism. So this is from that perspective that I present the paper today. And these are what I'm going to be doing is, as I also understand that this is mostly student-focused seminar and student-focused talk. So I'm not going to be reading out from a paper, but show you some slides to first give you an understanding of a theoretical framework of a kind of study that has not been widely popular. Of course, this is like in the emergence of it. And so I'll give you a theoretical framework of how I read this particular relationship between museums and colonialism, and then move quickly toward then to Leila Abu-Leila, the Scottish Sudanese writer Leila Abu-Leila, mainly her short story, The Museum, which was published in 1997 first. So back then, this was not still an issue about museums and colonialism. So let me just go and find out if I can share. Purva, can you just confirm if it is visible, because I can't see myself on the sort of on the screen.
So it's coming. Yes. So, okay. So can you just make it full screen? I mean, then it's all right.
Is it all right now?
Yes, perfect. Perfect.
Okay, great. So I'll move on now. So this is so let me just go with the basics of it. Okay, so we have two key terms. One is museums and one is colonialism. So the definition of colonialism, as many of you already probably know, country or an area under the control of another country and occupied by settlers from that country. That's the standard Oxford English Dictionary definition of it. So the term has been in use for some time, from the Greek apoikia, which means settlement, people far from home, etc., to 8th century BCE, from there to Roman colonus, from where we have got the term colony, right? Farmer tenant, that was mostly the meaning of it. So a farmer moving from elsewhere, going from one place to another, or probably working for somebody, the farmer tenant. From there, in the last 5 centuries, I believe, or whoever does sort of broad histories, sort of longitude kind of histories, the 5 centuries of colonialism have given us mostly two kinds of colonies. One is an exploitation colony, or one is a settler colony, right? And then Eleka Bamar, one of the noted post-colonial writers and thinkers, would sort of give us a definition, a working definition, in a widely noted book, Colonial and Post-Colonial Literature, that colonialism is the settlement of territory, the exploitation or development of resources, and the attempt to govern the indigenous inhabitants of occupied lands, often by force. So that's the definition that we get, that colonialism is actually about grabbing resources, and often by force. Okay, and then the post-colonial, I mean, if you just move on a little faster, the post-colonial is about liberation, right? Liberation from that kind of a colonial resource extraction ideology, that if you have to extract, if you have to make a colony a supply of resources, then you have to also probably give us infrastructure, right? Law, education, transportation, communication, etc. That's part of the modernity, the colonial modernity. So if we end that, we want to move into something where we now take, like the natives now take sort of the control of the country. If colonialism has also given us a concept of the nation, then the nation, with all its modern structures of law, education, etc., need to be carried forward. So post-colonial is the end of colonialism. But interesting part is that if we are following up from there, whatever we have been given, and we are following up from there and participating in the modern structure, then post-colonial is not necessarily an end of colonialism. It goes forward towards into the post-colonial period, post-colonial. If we just read it historically, that something ended 1947, 15th August, and then from 15th August till now, it is the post-colonial. In that sense, that after colonial. But if we are participating in the same structures of domination and exploitation, or same structures of education, infrastructure, in short, the ideology of knowing something, how we know something, how we cognize something, then we are carrying forward the leftovers or probably the broader structures of colonialism. So this is something that I wanted to also ask, like sort of remind you that post-colonial is not necessarily, as you probably already know, is the end of colonialism. It's a moving forward in a form which is much more coeval. Now the native and the colonial, they stand or they sit together with enough amount of force. I think the native can exert the force that otherwise would be marginalized. But these are all complicated statements, I understand. And I also believe that the native itself is a very complicated category, where you have certain individuals or population groups from certain classes, gender groups, or caste groups dominating, even proliferating during the colonial period, now taking over in the post-colonial period. So in that sense, the transfer of power is what there were 14 volumes of books that were edited by Nicholas Manserg, which came out in the name of Transfer of Power. So transfer between 1942 and 1947. It is about the documents and the letters that the British officials had written to themselves. So basically, this transfer of power is happening, and the power is going from the ruling elite, like the British elite, to the ruling Indian elite, right? So that has been mostly the tension about post-colonialism, that where exactly is the liberation. A lot of people would talk about that, write about that, where exactly is the liberation if the same forces that had sort of exploited us a century back are also coming back in full force. So this is where I would like to stop about colonial and post-colonial, to give you an understanding that many would consider post-colonial as a coagulation, as a coevality, sort of sitting together of the colonial structures and the neo-colonial or the after-colonial tendencies or structures. Now, this is where museums come in. As you understand, again, Cambridge English Dictionary defines museum as a building where objects of historical, scientific, or artistic interests are kept. Right? So again, a building where people can go to view works of art or objects of interest to science or history. Now, just to remind you that museums are not new. Museums have been there since as long back as maybe the use of the term kolonos or apoikia, right? So the Greeks had their own museums. Then Mesopotamian and Babylonian sort of civilizations had their museums where people could keep things. People have moved somewhere. They have brought, they have exchanged things, or they have their own things to, be glorious, sort of a glorious history. They're keeping them. So there is nothing wrong with keeping your artifacts to remind the generation that this is what happened. And this is precisely where statues and monuments came into being. Now, what happened is, for the last 5 centuries or 6 centuries or something like that, or maybe 10 centuries or what, when if we follow the 5-century rule, or like the European colonization sort of a rule, then you would know that it is not only about forming colonies and doing or sort of forming them into a body of supply and resources. It is also about stealing sometimes, and seizing, taking things without what we would probably in the modern 21st century called intellectual property right, or any kind of right, just seizing them and then keeping them in museums as artifacts or symbols of power and heritage and empire. So the British Empire, Empire, when it started becoming, having a sense of an empire, a strong power, an industrial nation, slowly industrializing itself, started also following what was there. I mean, this is a Greco-Roman civilization that they're mainly following, right? Even in literature and art. So here comes in emulation, let's say, of the previous civilizations and their museums, here comes the British Museum. British Museum was probably built in 1753, 1754. Now you understand the Palazzi is 1757. British are coming to India, let's say 1760s onwards, right? So that's when the British Museum, I think 1754 or 53, comes into being. And if you know, the Indian Museum in Calcutta, that is the National Museum or the National Library and the National Art House, National Museums, they're all coming out in the first half of the 19th century. I think the Indian Museum is 1814 or 1815, like very much close with Presidency College, Calcutta Medical College, all these sort of markers of glory and power and sort of education, modern forms of education, right? So these are coming also into being in the colonies, especially in India, South Africa. Museums are being built in the 19th century to sort of promote a particular ideology of power and particular ideology of sort of glory, right? So this is something that I'm asking you to think about, that how colonialism and the depiction of power and glory through artifacts and symbols as well as through literature are intimately tied. And this is something that we need to, and in the last few years have been brought into the fold, into questions. Throughout, students are asking, academics are asking, public bodies are asking, what are we holding in these museums and what are their histories, what are the narratives? When people from different parts of the world or from within the native base, they come and see these artifacts which were like 10th century or sort of something from 5th century AD or even 14th century or 1820s sort of African territory. If they have come from there, what are their narratives? And when after post-colonialism, maybe, especially a theory or a discourse which has allowed the natives or the colonized to voice forth their particular sort of conditions, then when the natives are coming and seeing these artifacts, what happens to them? Now, some of you may remember this film, Black Panther, was it? And this is where this sort of superhero based on a comic Marvel superhero series, where this sort of so-called antagonist who comes to the British Museum and sees an object and says that this has been stolen from my country, from my native country. So this is the kind of responses that museums have also been receiving for a long time. Now, here I would also like to remind you of that the British did not, or any kind of imperialists or colonialists did not just build empire because they build museums because they just wanted to do that. This was done, like everything else, in complete collaboration with the native. So I'd like to refer to a book here if you were interested. It is called Commodities and Culture in the Colonial World, edited by, among others, Supriya Chaudhuri, Rajeshwari Sundararajan, and I think there are two other editors as well. This was published in 2018 by Routledge, and in this book, Supriya Chaudhuri has an essay on exhibiting India, and she was showing how Bengali and Indian sort of art collectors or art enthusiasts, they were being actively consulted, and they were actively engaged in empire exhibitions in Britain, or let's say in France, in Netherlands. So Troilokanath Mukhopadhyay, who we Bengalis mostly know as a satirist, as a story writer, as a creative artist, was also, I think he was probably one of the few sort of directors, was it, of the Indian Art Museum, was also an art enthusiast, artifact art sort of object and artifact collector. And he was also, I think in the 1870s, or 1860s and 70s, he was also part of the agricultural team. And he knew William Wilson Hunter. So he knew some people, and he could also show his interest in exhibiting India, as in, like, which objects and artifacts should we show in Britain. So in Glasgow, where I'm based at, there were 4 empire exhibitions. These are like, sort of melas that we call empire exhibitions, where people, the countries, like Commonwealth countries, would come and showcase their artifacts and objects. So Trilokanath Mukhopadhyay was chosen to help sort of organize this, curate an exhibition. So these are, and that's besides what I'm not saying what is right or wrong. The point is, these were the things that happened. They happened for a particular discourse, for a particular ideology of empire, and these ideologies associated intimately with an ideology of imperialism and colonialism. So it cannot be. So museums cannot be discussed in when we discuss the ethics of the museum, the practice of the museum, without the kind of historical association museums have. Now, this is a quick quote from Kavita Singh from the essay, "The Museum is National." She's writing here that along with the national anthem, the national emblem, the national festival, nation needs its national library, its national archive, and its national museum. Poor indeed is the country that cannot lay claim to enough history to fill an archive, enough scholarship to fill a library, and enough artifacts to fill a museum. Thus, shortly after independence, the project of a National Museum for India was begun. Housed in an imposing building at the ceremonial heart of New Delhi, the museum was filled with art treasures that traced the nation's history from earliest times. As the new museum of a new nation, the National Museum was to celebrate the ancient culture of the young state. Like all new nations, India modeled the accoutrements of its nationhood on those of the colonial master states. The erection of a grand national museum became an act of great symbolic importance after independence. It was seen as a means of retrieving one's own past. So you understand that if for the colonialists, for the imperialists, the museums were means to showcase their power, their ideology, their sort of glory, then for independent nations such as India, which have finally sort of got liberation from the colonial rule, what is India? What is an India that we will cherish? We need artifacts again. So again, if you follow literature and films in the 40s and 50s, you would see that most of the films are talking about a utopian in nature, or have an utopian ending, that a new country is coming and we'll be better from what we were in the past 2, 3, or 4 decades, right? So a museum is intimately associated, as I said, with an ideology of the nation and the nation building. At the same time, and as you can understand, this is another quote that where Amy Laundrie, she writes, objects in museums are living entities, right? They embody layers of meaning, and they are deeply connected to the past, present, and future of indigenous communities. Every engagement with objects in museum cases or in collection rooms should begin with this core recognition. We are not just looking at interesting pieces. In the presence of objects from the past, we are privileged to stand as witnesses to living entities that remain intimately and inextricably tied to their descendant communities. So that's the thing I was thinking about. So I've given you these 2 quotes side by side. One is, why is there the need of a national museum after the birth of a nation? And then let's say 40, 50, 60, 70 years later, especially for India, 73 years later, or for Britain now after like same time, like about 75, 78 years later, why is there a need to question what we practice in these museums? By continuing to not question what we practice in this, how we collect, how we curate in these museums, are we silently or strongly following the same discourses of silencing and sort of obliterating histories of where these objects are? These are living entities. These objects are living entities. They have a story to tell. So it's important for us to either tell the story or to juxtapose sort of previous stories with the newer stories, or with the stories that should have been told but have never been told, right? So this is the kind of new methodological understanding that has come, especially in the wake of decolonizing sort of slogans and practices in academic spaces and public body activities. So this book is called Decolonizing Museums, Representing Native America in National and Tribal Museums. So these are the two things I wanted to show before I move forward to the story, so that you get an understanding of where I'm coming from about museums and colonialism. So this is Leela Abu Leila. Leela Abu Leila is, as you understand, is a Sudanese writer living in Scotland. She graduated from the University of Khartoum and then London School of Economics. She wrote The Museum, brought her in 1999. It brought her recognition, followed by Minare, which is 2005, then The Translator 2006, Lyrics Alley 2011, and Elsewhere Home 2019. Leela Abu Leila had lived in Aberdeen for a long time. Aberdeen is in Scotland for a long time, and as I said, she's a Scottish Sudanese. Now she's also I think she's now a citizen here in the UK. So she wants to talk about her Sudanese, of course, but she's mostly sort of touted, let's say, mostly called as a Scottish Sudanese writer. So I'm just using that term from there to just make sure that she has both the heritage. And then about the museum, I'm going to be talking about mostly very quickly about migrant and cultural difference. That is the story in the story, and then English and university space, but mainly looking at museum and colonial past, right? So what is this story about before I go there? The story is about these two characters, Shadia and Brian. Shadia has come, like Leela Abu Leila, is very autobiographical in that sense. As you see, it's 1999, but the story was written in 1997. And it is interesting because 1995 is when Victoria and Albert Museum in the UK first held a conference on these issues about how do we curate, what is the connection between museums and colonialism, how do we curate, how do we tell stories. So probably there is a connection between these sort of, let's say, path-breaking conference and the conception of this story, right? So Abu Leila came to do her master degree. She has a master degree in statistics from LSE. So Abu Leila came to do that from Khartoum, from Sudan, and then she was here. And in this particular story as well, we see Shadia, who has come from Sudan and doing her master degree, but in Aberdeen. And she is not being able to understand transition from her family and education system to the education system in the UK, which is like a 1 year, very fast moving education, like master degree. And she has got, like, she's already engaged, and she has her family telling her, reminding her all the time that, finish her degree, come back. And this is a great opportunity to be married to this man who is like holding some kind of a business, a small business. So I mean, and we also understand through this story that both of them, right, Abu Leila, Shadia and Brian. Shadia comes from a relatively upper class family, and Brian represents a working class Scotland. And she is at a loss in many senses of the term, that how could a country which we have read in novels and stories of being grand, beautiful, etc., also have so poor sort of a population group. And and also, how can these people also be so dismissive of us? So there is an intimate sort of disconnection between what what Shadia had, and I think we know this trope, right, already, that what Shadia thought about what the UK would be like, and what it turns out to be: boring, cold, dark, gloomy, and nobody cares about the natives. And this is where. And then Shadia asks for some help from Brian, who is also a studious, sort of a topper kind of the class kind of a student. So Shadia asks for his help, and slowly there is a relationship. There is a kind of a fancy that Shadia and Brian, both of them, take for each other, and then they decide. So Brian asks for Shadia to sort of on a date, and they decide. And Brian says, we have got a museum in Aberdeen. Why not go there? And I've seen some of the things from Africa there as well. We could just go and explore, and you could tell us what is happening there, the stories of them. And then when they enter the museum, then Sadia kind of almost collapses. The last 3 or 4, like 6 or 7 months of work have made her tiring in the UK. And then when she gets into the museum, that is the climax part of it, that she sees all these artifacts which are talking about the grandness, the grandeur and the glory of the empire of the British soldiers in Africa. And Africans are being represented as naked, and they have no sort of primitive, they have no culture, they are savage. And that's where she says that, continues to say that we are not like this. We already have computers, 7-Up, etc., etc. Again, showing that how Sudan is participating in the global economy. So this is how the story ends, and Sadia says, we cannot, I need to go now. So this is where the climax ends. So this is something, a few quotations from the story I just wanted to give you to just give you a sense of what Abu Layla is doing in the story. Okay, so I'll just read out a couple of them. So the first one, she had never seen a man with earring and such long hair. She's talking about Brian here. But then she had never known such cold, so much rain. Her silver earring was the strangeness. His silver earring was the strangeness of the West, another culture shock. So of course it starts with these culture shocks and different kinds of a man wearing a silver ring, and then the tremendously cold weather. So all these things, as you can, this is in the beginning, it's page 1. So you can understand that she's already going through a tough period, right, of not being able to transition, not being able to adapt to what is going on around. Then the next one, the glossy handbook for overseas students that explained about the famous British Reserve and hinted that they should be grateful. Things were worse for the South, less hospitable. In the cafeteria, drinking coffee with Asafa and the others, the picture of hospitable Scotland was something different. Badr, the Malaysian, blinked and whispered, "Yesterday, our windows got smashed. My wife today is afraid to go out." So see, this is something that we need to also remember, that this is the 90s story, and this is also this is not entirely untrue even today, right? The racist attacks and the race-related sort of violence is around, and it's happening. And with the coronavirus and the recessions, etc., things might even hike. But I think in the last years, also that Scotland in particular and the UK in general have done slightly better than what stories we have read from the 90s and early 2000s, especially in the wake of the 2001 World Trade Center collapse, right? That kind of terrorist attack. So whenever things like that happen, racist violence also increases, xenophobia also increases. As you understand, the social stability also increases. So here, without those things, they're not referring to any kind of world event that happened. They're just saying that they're going through this sort of everyday violence, and at the same time they're also reading that how good things are in Aberdeen or in Scotland or the famous British Reserve. And these handbooks are given, and when I started PhD, I also received handbook like that. What are the things that we need to do about Britain? What are the things that are different from elsewhere, etc.? And they help to some extent, but you realize living here for some time that how things work, right? So clearly there is a question about being a migrant and not being able to adapt to a cultural difference. So that's the thing I wanted to show, that Sadia has been going on, and this is a very short story, 10-12 pages. So even within this short length, the span of it, Abu Layla is able to give us the tensions that she's going through, especially not being able to adapt to, or rather it's not a good way of putting it, of engaging with another story and the setbacks of it, right? With another nation and the setbacks of it. Now, this is something I wanted to read out as well. So this is the more of the colonial and the Commonwealth part of the story. Look at some of the quotes here. So the first one, their countries were next door neighbors, but I want to remind you that their countries, Sadia is talking about her close sort of African friends, and she realizes that she has become more friends with African people than with, let's say, the white people in Britain, or rather, let's say, the majoritarian audience in Britain. Right. So she also observes that their countries were next door neighbors, but Asafa had never been to Sudan and Sadia had never been to Ethiopia. But we meet in Aberdeen, she had shrieked when this information was exchanged, giggling furiously. So this is also very interesting how the people from the Commonwealth, like for me in India, for somebody from South Africa, for somebody from Ethiopia, or somebody else from Sudan, we have, to some extent, because of colonization, the same heritage. We know about the common terms, but we've never been exchanging between us, right? And it is only in the while coming to the metropolitan city, to the sort of the metropolitan country, the colonial center, so to say, is when they're meeting, is when people are meeting with each other. Not that they talk a lot about what is going on, what is their heritage of colonialism. We never talk about, when I meet somebody, what is the heritage of colonialism, but we share these sort of relationships, right? In the same way that if you go to a university in India, which is slightly more sort of in pan-Indian in some sense, where people from different territories come, and you realize that there are shared sort of cultural relationships, but not entirely the same, like language, cuisine, etc. So that's happening also. Ironically, that's happening in the colonial center ground. Then again, he was on a plateau, not like her. She was punching and struggling for a piece of paper that would say she was awarded an MSc from a British university. For him, the course was a continuation. So again, the tensions going on between Shadia and sort of her adaptation, let's say, or her home country. So Brian slowed down, separated each word. I'll have them for you on Monday. Thank you. She spoke English better than him. How pathetic. The whole of him was pathetic. He wore the same shirt every blessed day, gray stripes and white. See, again, the very strong class-oriented sort of ideas and observations are coming very clearly from Shadia, that Shadia comes from a ruling, sort of an elite family. And Scotland is just another country which has its own problems of class, gender, race, etc. And there is a very strong working class. So, and the problem is that Shadia knows more about Scotland and Britain than Brian knows about Sudan. So that's the problem. There is not a mutual relationship, and that's precisely what's making Shadia even angrier in their sort of exchanges, verbal exchanges. So again, Shadia says, or rather the narrator says, she had grown up listening to the proper English of the BBC World Service only to come to Britain and find people saying yes, like it was said back home in Arabic, I. And here in Scotland, people say I for yes. So you see that this kind of, again, the cultural capital comes back here. Then we'll move on to the empire part of it, the Scotland and empire part of it. And I'll be quick here. I know about the time duration, so I'll be quick here. So Scotland and empire, the story is, again, from the story, look at these two sentences, those two statements. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Northeast Scotland made a disproportionate impact on the world at large by contributing so many skilled and committed individuals. In serving an empire, they gave and received, changed others, and were themselves changed, and often returned home with tangible reminders of their experiences. This particular statement comes from when she has visited a museum. Like these are from the final bits of it. She has now visited a museum with Brian, and she sees that just beneath a statue, like a not a statue, set up like a, let's say, a bust. Just beneath it, there is these are the words fixated, right? These are the words sort of on a plaque. And this is the reminder that people like this man or that man, they went from Scotland to far away world, no one knows where, and they changed the world, and they came back with their experiences of sort of global transformation. So this is what Sadia reads. And again, beneath on another statue, just beneath it, biographies of explorers were educated in Edinburgh. They knew what to take to Africa. Now, this is not, again, as you can understand, this is not written on a sort of a plaque. This is what the narrator says. Biographies of explorers who were educated in Edinburgh, they knew what to take to Africa. Doctors, courage, Christianity, commerce, civilization. Absolutely hitting the nail here. So they knew what they wanted to bring back. Cotton, watered by the Blue Nile, the Zambezi River. She touched the glass of a cabinet, showing papyrus rolls, copper pots. She pressed her forehead and nose against the cool glass. If she could enter the cabinet, she would not make a good exhibit. She wasn't right. She was too modern, too full of mathematics. Right? So that's the narratorial intervention, that what actually happened. So if this is the statement that you show beneath a bust, then this is what is happening actually. And she wouldn't make a good exhibit because she's too modern for that. And then again, the tangible reminders. So I'll just talk about. So look at the second part of this sentence. Nothing was of her. Whatever was showing was nothing about her. Nothing belonged to her life at home. What she missed, here was Europe's vision, the cliches about Africa, cold and old, right? So this is the kind of response, is the kind of reaction, is the kind of emotion that she goes through while in the museum with Brian. Now again, here I'll tell you about what happens. This is the first, this is the final pages, page 18 and page 19, final pages. So here again, what happens about, as I termed it, the national and the world. Now this is what she writes in the end, or rather, Abu Lela through Sadia tells us. So Sadia says to Brian, "They are telling you lies in this museum," she said. "Don't believe them. It's all wrong. It's not jungles and antelopes, it's people. We have things like computers and cars. We have 7-Up in Africa. And some people, a few people, have bathrooms with golden taps. I shouldn't be here with you. You should not talk to me." You see, these are the final lines that Shadia says, that this is a lie. A museum is a complete lie. All you get to know about us is that we are savages and we don't know how to even wear clothes and we are walking naked. And look, come and see in Sudan, you'll find like people not only having like in the modern lifestyle, but also the very ultra modern things like bathrooms with golden tent. That comes from a reference to their conversation, their domestic conversation, where her mother tells Sadia that her fiance has already fixed like, sort of golden taps on the bathroom. So that's where she comes from. She reminds Brian that, this is what we are, and look what we have been represented. So the moment you see me, I'm sure like you're actually seeing that particular Africa that has been represented in your country for years and that you have grown up watching. Then Brian, who has been given a slightly better character in this story, but I think it's a very flat representation of Brian. Brian has not been represented. It's all about Shadia. So Brian wants to change. Brian says, he said, museums change. I can change. And then the final line is, he didn't know it was a steep path she had no strength for. He did not understand. So again, this particular point about museums change, and Brian is, look how forward-looking Brian is. Museums change is a strong statement in 1999 to have, that okay, museums might change, new things might come, new ways of writing the museum might happen, and I could also change. And that's the redemption of Brian to some extent by Abu Lela as a character, I mean. And then Abu Lela also ends the story. The narrator says he did not understand, and that's precisely I wanted to remind you that these relationships between natives and colonizers in these museums are unequal relationships, absolutely uneven, unequal relationships, where a particular person wants to represent a country or the glory or let's say the heritage of a country in a particular style through objects and artifacts, until and unless they are re-narrativized, they are given their proper context, these particular objects and symbols or artifacts, they continue to promote an ideology of dissociation and non-comprehensibility. He did not understand, precisely because impossible for Brian to imagine and understand what's going on in Africa. It's all the representation that's coming up through this museum. So this is in response to that, as I said in the beginning, there have been a few sort of very strong let's say visible practices of if a museum can be decolonized, right? By decolonized, the point is not to uproot everything, but to give a new narrative, right? So here is what Sumaya Qasim, who was given, is one of the few curators who was given the task to redesign certain parts of a Birmingham museum. I think the project was called The Past Is Now. And she wrote a piece on this sort of webzine, Media Diversified. And she writes, and I'll read out very quickly, for many people of color, collections symbolize historic and ongoing trauma and theft. Behind every beautiful object and historically important building or monument is trauma. You don't know what it is used for, what context it's from, how it was brought here, who stole it. The museum as it exists today is so much an imperialist project and is so much about power. The craftsmanship, the display case, the beauty of the institution that collects and protects its imperial hoard, the way items are described, the way they are catalogued, and what gets shown and what remains hidden, all work to deny, retreat, and forget. So she is, as I said, she has been designing and curating as part of a team. And this is an emotionally charged piece, and she's written about it as well. And this is something that comes to us quite often, that how do you engage with a space which is so violent and uneven? It is very being. Then again, she adds that decolonizing is deeper than just being represented. When projects and institutions proclaim a commitment to diversity, inclusion, or decoloniality, we need to attend to these claims with a critical eye. Decoloniality is a complex set of ideas. It requires complex processes, space, money, and time. Otherwise, it runs the risk of becoming another buzzword like diversity. As interest in decolonial thought grows, we must be aware of museums and other institutions' propensity to collect and exhibit because there is a danger. Some may argue an inevitability that the museum will exhibit decoloniality in much the same way they display or displayed black and brown bodies as part of empire's collection. So you see that she's absolutely hitting at some of these challenges, right? How do we not only decolonize, so what are the challenges of decolonizing the museum, that it might just get co-opted in another way, rather the radical edge might all be sort of run out. And this is another piece from Raquel Minon, which also part of the past is, as you can see the title, The Past is Now, Confronting Museums' Complicity in Imperial Celebration, came out in 2019. And here is what she writes, and these are some of the challenges of decolonizing the museum to me, and of course, like to the teams working on this. To begin decolonial work in museums, the notion of the museum as a neutral space must first be challenged. Such a challenge also requires an exploration of the impact that previous presentations of false neutrality have had on the representation of histories. For many museum workers, this means examining their individual positionality through a critical lens. It involves exploring how identities inform subconscious choice in museum curation, such as the choice of what information is gathered in researching an exhibition and how it is shared and interpreted. The instinct used to create a display that feels aesthetically right, and even the choice of who is consulted and employed, designer, academics, volunteers, and how we find them, diversifying our workforce, everything is important. So this is a long, this cannot be done instantaneously. One day we decide to decolonize the museum. It is as long a process as museums have sort of exerted their existence and influence and power, how they have shaped knowledge, how they have shaped ideologies, and the way we know things, we understand things, right? So that's the project that's taking place. In Glasgow, we have a museum called the Hunterian Museum, part of the Glasgow University. So here I'm already in work with a couple of senior curators who are designing, or sort of in the next months, were designing a project partly influenced by a project in Manchester called Curating Discomfort. Now, these are the things going on, like how do you tell the story? How do you give us a new narrative, where the narratives that the injustice that the previous narrative had would rather be questioned and challenged with another narrative? And who are these writers who are writing these new narratives? And where do they come from? How do we trust on their, let's say, knowledge or goodwill or whatever they're bringing forth to a particular? So all these questions become very important, and as important as sort of the museum project in the 18th century, the colonial project of the museums. And this is the final slide. And this is where Abu Leila says that if I go back to Sudan, I will never write again. I said this when I first started writing in Aberdeen. In the grayness of culture shock and bad weather, the writing was there, warm and glowing, a new hope, an opportunity, a way of contact with my past, walking in Aberdeen, studying words about another place. So that's the kind of thing also we need to remember, that projects like decolonizing the museum, projects like decolonial literature, post-colonial literature, coming from this culture shock, from this understanding that, okay, how we have been taught, what we have imagined, how Wordsworth's Daffodil, or sort of Shakespeare's writing of Europe in the 15th or 16th century, how we have imagined things are radically or very much different from when you come to a particular metropolitan center, and the reception that you get, the kind of cultural reception. So That's very important, that many of these works are coming out of this cultural trauma, of this cultural sort of misapprehension. So here is where I believe that when, as long as, like, people like Abu Lela will continue to write and talk about their sort of the disjunction that she feels while being based in a metropolitan country, more of this work of decolonizing curriculum, decolonizing the museum, decolonizing the university, and the academic spaces which confront, which create and produce knowledge, this kind of spaces will continue to be challenged by this kind of writers writing about their experiences in the narrative aesthetic form. So I'll just stop here. Thank you for listening. I'll go back to the stop sharing it and go back to the screen. All right. Am I audible, Purva? Just to reconfirm.
Yes, sir. You're audible.
Okay. Thank you so much, Purva, for and your audience for listening. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Okay. So, Dr. Bhattacharya, I thank you for such an enlightening talk. And I would just like to add, yesterday we had a talk by Dr. Arnob Kumar Sinha from the University of Nardwar, who's working on indentured labor narratives. And he was talking about the politics of archiving and how the indentured the families of indentured laborers, they are working really hard in addressing this politics of archiving. And today you gave us this wonderful lecture on museums and these projects of colonialism and then decolonization. So I think it both these lectures, and it comes it now we have a holistic idea of what really the post-colonial study should be addressing right now. And the way you clarified your position, based in Glasgow right now, but coming from Calcutta and all these things, I think it made your lecture really, really insightful and invigorating. So without much further ado, I'll ask Mr. Das to conduct the question and answer session. Over to you, Mr. Das.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Dr. Bhattacharya, the first question is from Sana Tabasum, Assistant Professor. She asks, how far do you think colonial writings have evolved over the period of time, and what major changes did it undergo?
Yeah. So could you just repeat the first part of the question? Like colonial writings, I just didn't understand the first part about the historical part. Just if you just repeat it again.
Hello?
Yes, please. Can you just repeat the first part of the question?
No, sure. How far do you think colonial writings have evolved over the period of time?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
This is it. And the second, and the second part is, what major changes did it undergo?
Okay. So colonial writings for me, as somebody who is working on post-colonial studies and in the areas of, let's say, colonial and post-colonial studies, colonial writings have, if you term it colonial, then it has a direct bearing upon colonialism, right? So colonialism, it's a complicated question when it comes to talking about European colonialism, right? Colonialism has been, as I started, that's precisely why I started with the categorical or etymological meaning of the term. Romans and Grecians and sort of Greece, Rome, and to some extent other countries in the so-called Middle East today, or West Asia and India, all of like South Asian civilizations, all of had at some point would have a practice of colonialism. If it is about moving away from the center, from the metropolitan center, to go elsewhere and settling down over there, right? Like as a tenant, a farmer. And then what you do is, poikia was a better term for me, was that you also want to reproduce the mainstream culture, the mainland culture. So you want to reproduce food, language, school, like maybe like education, talking, the native forms of farming. So if any culture in that sense would be talking about and then writing literature or writing about then that culture would have a bearing upon, or would have taken after colonial structures, the colonial style of living or life, right? But the more modern meaning of the term is coming from the European form of colonial. That's precisely why I wanted to also remind you of the two kind of colonies that have come out in the wake of European colonization in the 15th century onward, is exploitation colonies and sort of resource colonies, let's say. And these are colonies where you have seen that, and I'm reading about some letters about the 1943 Bengal famine. As I said, the transfer of power between people like sort of viceroys and governor generals, what they wrote about the situation. And I would say that in many cases, they still continue to believe that India is a source of supplies, right? A colony is a supplier, it's a market. It's a market where you extract raw materials, you build something in your own countries, and then you also sell in the colonies, right? So it's a market. So any if we take this economic logic away, if we think about how the economic logic was hidden, was sort of masqueraded by a more cultural logic of look at us, we are colonizers, we're giving you excellent education, and look at our writings, look at the way sort of we think. So Enlightenment discourses by a host of Scottish thinkers, and then so everything will emulate, take pride in the fact that we are here and educating you, civilizing you, making you more. So this is something which has brought into us, which has been systematically brought into our mind for 3 or 4 centuries, right? Especially in the last 2 centuries. And this is the same economy and same culture we take part. Like I have grown up, like we are growing up in a culture that has given us an education that is very much modeled upon the education that probably 2 centuries back England or sort of France would have in their own countries. So, and that's precisely why I can come to the UK and teach here, because it is an easy transition. It's not, of course, easy, very complicated, but it is a familiar ground. So we are all participating in that. And for no way that I'm saying that the natives are exempt, or the so-called citizens of the ex-colonized countries are exempt of the responsibilities. It's always happened in collaboration. And so colonial writings might, in that sense, start from, if we are following the modern European meaning of it, from the 14th or 15th century onward. The travelogues that were written, the plays that were written. For instance, Shakespeare's The Tempest would be an excellent case study for a colonial reading, like how Prospero and the relationship between Prospero and then Ariel, Caliban, etc., and has already been widely written about. I'm not saying that these things have not been done. I'm just like relating them to your audience, that as back as Shakespeare, 1560s born, like 1590s, 1600. So this is when Shakespeare is writing. That we could go even before that, like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales could have, and Spenser's Fairy Queen. So from there onward, right, from the 15th and 16th century till today, it could be a longer kind of line of colonial writings. So this is what comes to mind to your question. And I feel that when it comes to talking about artifacts and objects, these objects have to appear. If the museum project was an 18th century imperial project, they would have to appear in the novels or the literature, like the poetry or the literature of it. And I'm going through poetry by Robert Southey, and then novels of Walter Scott, or Opium, Thomas de Quincey's The Opium Eater. Look at the opium coming into being as an important thing to think about. Opium is taking form in a poetry. So precisely because of the opium roots in China and India in the late 18th, early 19th century. So this is how, I mean, the economic logic gets, as I said, gets subdued, but they continue to shape the way we think about it. That doesn't mean that one is determining the other, a kind of vulgar, crude determinism logic. The point is they are shaping each other. It's impossible to do culture, to invent something without not being aware of what is going on socially and economically. So that would be my response to that.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. The next question is from Dr. Muhammad Siddiq, headmaster, Masudia Arabic High School. He says, museums are a part of our culture and of our civilization and culture. But what is the symbol of the civilization of today's science and technology?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for this question as well. The concept of here, three things are coming here. One is that museums is a symbol of civilization, of culture. Second is about science, right? So as I have been talking about it, the museums, the concept of civilization is very colonial. Like there is a book by Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. This was a debatable, controversial sort of pronouncement in the book. But as I said throughout in this lecture, that museums come into being with the concept of civilization that have been that we have inherited from the British colonials, so the British colonial or imperialist ideas. I'm not saying, as I said in the beginning, I'm not giving your value judgments, what is good or what is bad. It is our life, it is our existence. But if it is our life, it is our existence, then we also have the right to question, to find out why is it our life, why it is our existence like that, right? So this is where the questions, the questions about how museums operate, what happens there, come into being. But about the second part of your question, about science, I think the definition of the museum went, it is about as much showcasing of culture as about science. There are museums, the concept of museums came into being as a natural museum. Natural museum is the natural world, the sciences and the natural world. So British Museum, if you one of the sort of icons of imperial museums, British museums has huge sections about sort of prehistoric sciences and the prehistoric fossils, bone structures, then about the natural world, the kind of biodiversity that we see. So I think the concept of culture is also if we think about culture as in Sanskriti, culture, what we everyday live, the kind of culture or let alone civilization is also tied with the concept of science, the kind of breakthroughs in colonial science, right? From the 18th century onward. I say colonial science because malaria or some of the breakthroughs in epidemiology in the 19th and early 20th century, or early sort of late 19th century, were coming out as tropical medicine, right? I mean, what are going on in India, South Africa, and what are their problems, and sort of to devise something out of it as a glory, as we have done some. So science and colonialism, and already people have written about it, number of important works. So are already there. So I'm not going into there. So point being that museums is as much about culture as about science, precisely because science is as much about culture as culture is about science. So museums will not be able to showcase only culture. Where do you show your culture? Like museums cannot showcase only busts and statues and monuments of important, iconic, symbolic and cultural beings, such as, let's say, Rabindranath, in the Bengali sense of the term, it's a Rabindranath Tagore, or let's say, Kazi Nazrul Islam, etc. But continue to also show how important scientific figures and scientific achievements have also come into being, even in the Harappan civilization, if they have those artifacts. So I think museums can very strongly qualify for that symbolic sort of preserver of science that you refer to.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for your response. So the next question is by Siddharam Bhasake. He asks, which work is most important in post-colonial and why? And could you please mention the writer and the name of the book?
Right. So this is, as I understand, this is post-colonial studies has been a field for the last, let's say, 3 to 4 decades, right? So 1978 is when Edward Said published Orientalism. So it's, of course, a foundational book for the field, I mean. Okay, post-colonial studies as a field, an academic field of study. But much before that, there have been plenty of writings on areas which would be the predecessors of post-colonial studies as a field. So, for instance, Frantz Fanon's writings, published mostly in the 50s and 60s, The Wretched of the Earth would be a foundational text for the field of post-colonial studies. I think it was published in 1963 or 4. Then before that, you would have the writings of, let's say, Bhagat Singh in India, the anti-colonial writings of it, the anti-colonial writings of Mahatma Gandhi, Ambedkar, Jyotiba Phule. All these writings could be equally read in the lens of post-colonialism, but their predecessors, post-colonial as a field, right? So post-colonial as a field of study is more Anglo-American rather than anti-colonialism, which is more like ex-colonized countries happening. So Frantz Fanon is writing from Martinique, Bhagat Singh from India, right? So somebody from, let's say, Nigeria or South Africa. So this is happening in the 1930s, 40s, the decades leading to decolonization globally. But post-colonial studies as a field, as I said, Edward Said's Orientalism is a foundational book, and then Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's number of essays, especially Can the Subaltern Speak, is widely called as another foundational text, the essay. And then another figure that is routinely talked about as another foundational figure is Homi Bhabha, right? And the collection of his writings, his essays, came into the collection called Location of Culture. But then again, apart from these three, who have a more of a, let's say, post-structuralist bent of post-colonial writing, there is also Marxist or feminist or deconstructive or structuralist, different bends of post-colonial writing, right? So Annie McClintock written once about this in an essay called The Pitfalls of Post-Colonialism. This is all coming out in the 1940s. Arif Darlik wrote an essay called Third World Intellectuals in the First World, the aura of, something to do with the aura of post-colonialism, like Third World Intellectuals in the First World Academy. That's when post-colonialism happens. So a lot of the things are happening in the 1990s in articles and essays in journals, and these are some of the journals like Ariel or like Wasafiri, and then World Literature Quarterly, which became Journal of Post-Colonial Writing, which are holding these debates as well. So these are some of the works that you can start with, but there are already primers and anthologies such as Post-Colonial Studies collection, let's say by Leela Gandhi, who has written a book on post-colonial studies. Ania Lumba has written a book on colonialism and post-colonialism. These are mostly primers and anthologies people have written about how the field has come into being and what are the challenges within the field, etc. So you can also sort of consult these works as well.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya, for your response. So the next question is from Jaya Selvi. She's an assistant professor. She writes, when the colonizer made sure that most of the native artifacts were destroyed, how to establish this utopic museum in the present era? She further writes, aren't there archaeological difficulties in establishing one? How to overcome this problem? It would be great if you could comment on this.
Yeah, that's a great question again. Thank you so much. I mean, first of all, we need to start from this point that if the colonialists, let's not invent it, it's established a museum to showcase or to build a culture, to showcase that we are building a culture. A museum is one of the few artistic, cultural icons to showcase that now we are in the process of building cultures. We have a culture, right? We have a history, we have a heritage. We can preserve that heritage. If it is something that's happening in the mid 18th, late 18th century, and the kind of, in India, for instance, it's only in the early 19th century that you have museums, then you know that they're also promoting the same culture in the colonies, right? So when they departed, and the British were hardly let's say, raising down these museums, their seats of glory, they wouldn't do that. So in many cases, if they had established them, so the Indian Museum stands, right, today. Everything that they had built in the colonies, showcase culture, etc., they stand. So it would be a stretch of, it would be like exaggeration to say that, okay, they have most of these native artifacts, are not there in the museum. But I understand your point that these artifacts have come to be in these museums precisely because they are stolen from elsewhere, or they were like seized from elsewhere, however we put it. So from even from most of the expeditions in Africa, many of the artifacts have been stolen from the native tribes, right? And they have come here without proper narrativization, precisely because nobody knows of these stories. So who gets to tell these stories? So should we call now this person or this person of the tribe or somebody who doesn't even remember what went on about this because they have been stolen? He or she has already sort of heard about them, or does this tribe even exist today? So, I mean, is the artifact the only remnant of the tribe? So there are I mean in Glasgow in the Kelvin Grove Museum, and I've got to know after coming here from Professor Willie Malley, who also introduced me to this story. So according to Professor Malley, there was a the same problem with I think with the Canadian tribe, and a tribal artifact was there, and they were like claiming it. And finally, I think it was in 2000 or later 2000, is to understand the post 1995 repercussions of that conference, that people were claiming these artifacts, like the claim that we sometimes in Indians make on the Kohinoor. So to claim these artifacts, then the further question comes that give us a way, give us a means, give us a sort of proof that you can also preserve this 2-century-old artifact. Now, tribal person could always answer that we have been carrying it for centuries. You stole it from us and then suddenly dematerialized it, denarrativized it, right? So these are all, and now that we have participated in a global economy, things get stolen quite easily. And so you can't always blame this 19th century imperial. It's like the Nobel Prize got stolen from Rabindranath Tagore's Vishwabharati Shantiniketan. So things get stolen because that's the logic that we have been brought into because of capitalism and because of property and other forms of owning things, right? Owning, I own this, I can sell this, I can get money, and then I can continue my life. I'm not blaming somebody who has done that. I don't know the reasons for stealing these things, but if you steal something, a whole culture, a whole tribe, and then bring it and then showcase that, that is where the violence lies, right? The showcasing of it, that look, this is what we found, and we do not know what its story is, but I think it can be auctioned and it can then be circulated in different museums to showcase as a trophy, the trophy of our victory, our glory. So that's where the problem lies, and that's where I think for ex-colonial countries such as in India, Nigeria, South Africa, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then Caribbean islands, if there are existing museums, then there could be the re-narrativizing of the stories as they're happening in the metropolitan cities and countries. The re-narrativization must take place, and it's probably the onus is on the government, on the public bodies, on the councils, on the corporations, on how do they deal with it, how do they sort of engage with it. There are plenty of things that people have to think about here. The partition, we do not have a museum about the partition that was also marked, our independence, which was marked by a bloody event of the partition, right? We do not have a museum of the famine, of the 1943 famine, and when Ireland already has so many statues and monuments. So what does it tell us about remembering our past, our very immediate past? So these are questions that we need to deal with before, or rather alongside, the question of decolonization.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya, for your response. So the next question is from Sumit Ghosh, doctoral researcher at Jadavpur University. He asks, how can you discuss museum as a homogeneous category as the idea of imperialism is vividly connected with this? Should I repeat the question once?
No, it's all right. Thank you. Thanks for the question. I think, a museum can never be a homogeneous category, right? Precisely because the artifacts are different. The artifacts are coming from elsewhere. So the coming from elsewhere already questions the homogeneity of it. But the ideology could be in a particular way that museums came into being could be an example of cultural homogenization. That look, finally, after when we talk about the heterogeneity within the museum, the artifacts and their stories, all of these artifacts are trying to tell a new story, right? When this is happening, once we go beyond that and we see the museum as a material place, what does it tell us? Okay, this is where the culture is preserved. What kind of culture? Is probably the culture of the 500 or 1,000 years of civilizations, right? It could be like something that Rakhal Das Bandyopadhyay found in the Harappa, or the something like some kind of archaeological finding, which is of great pride to us. It has to be there. It also shows that, okay, somebody has done excellent work. So in that sense, of course, it is impossible to talk about the homogeneity of it when you talk about the objects that create that space. But the structure of the museum, the being of the museum, is always about the feeling of preservation of a culture. Whether it's a heterogeneous culture, we never talk about. And these are questions that I'm asking, not me. Plenty of people have already started asking, and I'm just relaying to your audience.
Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya, for your responses. We have no more questions for this session. Over to you, Professor Chakraborty.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. That was really wonderful. Now we will move on to our next speaker.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I'll sign off and let her come. Looking forward to our post-talk. Thank you.
Okay. So I welcome Dr. Chattopadhyay now, an amazing speaker and scholar of great renown. And we are really proud to have him here today. I'll introduce him now. He is an assistant professor working in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Gandhinagar. He is BA, MA, MPhil in English Literature from Presidency College and Jadavpur University. His MPhil thesis on Samuel Beckett and Alan Badu, and finished his PhD from Western Sydney University on Beckett and Lacanian psychoanalysis. He has been published in books like Deluge and Beckett, Knott's Post-Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Literature and Film, Gerald Murnane, Another World in This One, etc., and journals such as Textual Practice, Interventions, Samuel Beckett Today, Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, Sound Studies, and the Harold Pinter Review. He has co-edited the book Samuel Beckett and the Encounter of Philosophy and Literature, and has guest edited the SBTA issue on Samuel Beckett and the Extensions of the Mind. Orko is the chief editor of the online literary journal Shongla. His monograph, Beckett, Lacan and the Mathematical Writing of the Real, has been published by Bloomsbury in 2019. He is currently finishing co-editing a volume on Navarun Bhattacharya for Bloomsbury, India, slated for 2020, and working on another volume on Badu and modernism. So with these words, I welcome Dr. Chattopadhyay to share his presentation with us today. Welcome, sir, and over to you.
Thank you, Purvita, and thank you to all the organizers of the college who have, I'm sure, taken a lot of pain and labor to organize this set of talks. To open with an apology, I could not attend the previous sessions, partially because we are in the middle of a fully functional semester here in IIT Gandhinagar. It's a fully functional digital semester, and we have classes and everything else. It's just that everything has become digital, like this talk now. I would definitely have loved to go and visit Alipurduar, as I have done quite a few times in the past, and be with all of you to deliver this talk. But I guess we have to make do with whatever we have. And these are difficult times. Let's see what we can do on this particular format. It was lovely to listen to Shorit, a friend of mine for almost 16 years now. And it's wonderful to sort of, I suppose, come after him and talk about a completely different thing. But let me pick up a particular moment from Shorit's talk, which might have a contrastive point in relation to what I will be talking about. So there was a reference to mathematics in the short story on the museum that Shorit was working his way through. And it's interesting how mathematics in that particular moment, to be honest, I haven't read the short story, but with the citation Shorit had, mathematics had this particular schematic value of talking about history in terms of numbers. And there was a certain suggestion, at least in that moment in the short story, that mathematics could become a reductive schema for a certain kind of exploitative history. So with that as an opening thought, let me talk about mathematics in a completely different way, where we are talking about mathematical formalization in the philosophy of the contemporary French thinker, Alain Badiou. And we are talking about an ontology that Badiou creates. This ontology is as mathematical as it is political. So I'll talk about this particular coincidence of the mathematical and the political, but political not in a reductive, violent sense, political in an egalitarian, revolutionary sensibility. In fact, to be true to Badiou's spirit, we are talking about the being of politics here, the being of the political. More than the governmentality, politics as a category of philosophical thinking. So to introduce you, and most of this talk, I will come to a literary text towards the end, most of this talk has a certain explicatory dimension, because I'm also primarily addressing this talk to students and also people who might be interested in Badiou's system. So the book that I wrote was a reading of Beckett's late prose through philosophy of mathematics as it finds itself in the later teachings of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Philosophy of mathematics is a huge area which starts as early as Plato, when, for example, and this is Badiou's famous reading of Plato's Republic, when Plato makes this kind of a contrast between the poet who is supposed to be sort of, excluded from his ideal republic, and the geometer, the mathematician or the geometer who is welcome in that republic. Badiou calls this a kind of interruption of the poem through the matheme. The poet is excluded, but the mathematician is the ideal point of inclusion for a republic. And again, note the fact that we are talking about a polis. We are talking about a political society, let's say, the society of the republic. So from the very beginning, from that Platonic moment, mathematics has something to say to politics. And this is the intersection I will be trying to address through Badiou's mathematical as well as political ontology. Now, what is ontology? Ontology is, in a traditional sense, considered the first philosophy. The first philosophy in the sense that it's the fundamental philosophical tradition that is a study of being. Study of being, right? Now, Badiou makes this clear distinction between ontology and logic. Ontology is the study of being qua being. What does that mean? Being in relation to another being. Qua is a mathematical or logical term he uses there. Being qua being is the subject of ontology. And he studies this through Georg Cantor and Zermelo Fraenkel's set theory. So I'll talk about that. The second part of this project is where he talks about logic. So there is a distinction, a very clear distinction he makes between mathematics and logic. Now, this mathematical ontology is what he proposes in his famous 1988 book, which took almost 2 decades to be translated, and not for nothing, it's a complex book. The first book that he wrote in 1988 is Being an Event, Lettre à Vonnement. So The Being an Event is the book where he suggests this mathematical ontology with a slightly propagandist statement, as he would himself say, that ontology is mathematics. It's not a metaphor. Mathematics is not a metaphor for ontology. Mathematics is ontology. This is Badiou's famous, as I said, somewhat propagandist claim at the beginning of Being an Event. Mathematics is ontology. So mathematics is the study of being qua being. Whereas in the second book, in 2006, when he wrote Logique du Monde, The Logics of Worlds, that second book is about logic. It's a logical or phenomenological approach to something else. What is this something else? Being in relation to appearing, being qua appearing. So being qua being is ontology, and being qua appearing is the field of logic. And here, he primarily took his references from Grothendieck's category theory, or what is called topoi theory, topos theory as well as topoi theory in the plural, and he took his reference points from this sort of continuation from set theory to category theory. So category theory is what Badiou calls the greater logic in relation to something like formal logic that we see in Aristotle's prior analytics and the formal logic system. In any case, I'll come back to some of these things. I'm just introducing the cards of the deck here. So we have this project of a mathematical approach to being qua being and a logical approach to being qua appearing. Now, you must be wondering, what is the distinction between these two things? So being, as I said, and let's say primarily we are talking about the human being here, not so much the non-human being, right? We are talking about the human being. Ontology is a study of the relations among human beings, the relations between one human being and another, right? And these relations are ontological too. Not only are the beings ontological, there is an ontological status to the relations among beings. Now, in this particular project of mathematical ontology, why is Badiou saying that ontology is mathematical? Ontology is mathematics and mathematics is ontology. Why is he drawing this particular equivalence between the two things? Because for Badiou, a being is what he calls a pure multiple. What does that mean? It's a multiple of a multiple. So the more you break it down, the more you get further multiplicities or other multiplicities. So there is no such thing as one unified being. And when you fragment one being, what you get is another multiple. You fragment that multiple, you get another multiple. And set theory, especially with its Cantorian idea of infinity, actual infinity, Cantor's famous continuum hypothesis is what we are talking about. Set theory for Badiou philosophically materializes this ontology of the pure being or being qua being in relation to being. Now, what is this idea of being in relation to being? And there is a certain notion of politics which is attached to this idea of relational ontology, the relation between one being and another. I'll come to that, but before that, let me make a set of general observations about where Badiou is coming from. So Badiou is one of the students of Louis Althusser, the famous French structuralist Marxist, along with Jacques Rossier, and again, a friend of his and a fellow philosopher. So in that Althusserian way of reading Marx, we have a certain concentration on Marx's doctoral thesis, Karl Marx's doctoral thesis, which was on materialism, pre-Socratic materialism. So the Greek antique philosophy of materialism. And especially this idea that there is a chance encounter that happens among the atoms that fall on a void. the atoms swerve by chance. This is called clinamen in pre-Socratic theories of materialism. And this clinamen makes sure two atoms falling vertically on a void somehow come together and meet. So there's this idea of a chance encounter that Marx gets interested in. And this is Althusser's famous point that there is no philosophy in Marx's thought. A very important point that Althusser makes, a tendentious claim, but a very important claim that we could discuss, of course. So this is his contention. There is no philosophy in Marx, from that famous moment in the thesis on Feuerbach, where Marx says, philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. Althusser himself, especially in his late work, and if you're interested, you could read the book Philosophy of Encounter, which is a series of his late essays. Althusser himself thinks through this pre-Socratic question of the clinamen and what he calls the philosophy of encounter, the philosophy of encounter as an event. Now, we have a lineage of this in Badiou, who thinks through this notion of the event. I mean, I'm assuming, even if you haven't sort of perhaps read Badiou, and I wouldn't assume you have, I'm trying to introduce Badiou here for you. So Badiou is a philosopher of the event. And this is what he's heading towards, both with the mathematical ontology and the logical idea of being appearing. Okay? So there's a certain way in which, through mathematics, Badiou is also reopening the question of materialism. The question of materialism in a political, dialectical sense. So what we have in Badiou, through this sort of passage into mathematics, is a philosophical theory of revolutionary events and a philosophical theory of change. So we go back to the Althusserian thread of event as a chance encounter, an encounter that leads to a change, a creation, a new creation. So in Badiou's philosophy, he talks about 4 conditions of philosophy. One is science, which he primarily treats through mathematics. 2 is art, which is art in its entirety, including literature. He writes quite a bit on literature. 3 is love. Love as a particular process between 2 people or more, right? Leading to some sort of a collective formation. And the 4, of course, is politics. So science, art, love, and politics. These are the 4 transversal conditions of philosophy for Badiou. What does the word transversal mean? It means that philosophy cannot be exclusively identified with any of these 4 conditions. Philosophy deals with each of these 4 conditions in Badiou's vision without being sutured, what he calls sutured or knotted up exclusively with any of the 4 conditions. This is what also means that he's not, fundamentally speaking, a Marxist philosopher. He's a post-Marxist philosopher, because Marxism, for him, is the suture of philosophy with politics. Nietzsche, for example, for Badiou, this is how he reads Nietzsche. Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, is the philosopher who sutures art. And to a certain extent, he also includes Heidegger here, the famous German philosopher, Martin Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger, Friedrich Nietzsche, these are philosophers, according to Badiou, who suture art with philosophy. Philosophy becomes art in Heidegger or in Nietzsche, just as philosophy becomes politics in Karl Marx's thought. So he would want to maintain a certain degree of distance from these suturings, because his idea is, and this is the sort of ideological position he takes, that philosophy does not have a truth of its own. Again, a very important point to understand for Badiou's system. Philosophy does not have a truth of its own. Each of these conditions, as I said, are processes of truth. But each of these conditions are only processes of truth if something happens in them. So there's this philosophy of the event which governs all these four conditions. There's an event in politics, there's an event in love, there's an event in art, and again, there's an event in science. These events are disruptive moments or disruptive moments of happenings, chance encounters that lead to the formation of a truth. So truth is something that comes in the wake of an event. And in each of these conditions, we have a truth that comes into its work, as it were, only in the wake of the event that happens. So of course, this begs the question now, what is an event for Baju? What is an event? And what is an event in politics? What is an event in love? What is an event in mathematics? What is an event in art? Of course, I won't be able to do justice to all these questions, but this was a necessary setup in relation to Baju's system. Now I would talk specifically about the way he reads the event in relation to mathematics in these two magnum opuses, so to speak, first being an event and then Logics of Worlds. These are extremely dense and complex books. And again, let us not have this idea that I'll be able to do justice. I can only do injustice to these books in this very short presentation. But the idea is to encourage some of you who are listening to read some of these books. Perhaps this would be a mapping that would help you to read some of these books. The connection that I would make in terms of an argument of my own, and here I'm also sort of, in a way, preparing for a book that I'm in the first stages of writing on philosophy of mathematics and modernist literature. I'm trying to think to what extent this mathematical and logical ontology of being qua being and being qua appearing can be, somehow comparatively evoked in relation to the world of a literary text. And we will very briefly see that perhaps towards the end of this talk. Let me continue with some of the ramifications of this notion of the event in relation to mathematics, in being an event, and then in Logics of Worlds. So a set theory is an idea of a set. A set is, let's say, a collection of elements, but it is not a totalization of elements. This is important to understand because this is the Cantorian sort of, implication of set theory. We are talking about sets that are collections of elements, but they are not totalizations. Now, there is a one of a set, and there is the one of an element. Now, there are axioms of set theory, which were organized by Zermelo-Fraenkel, which is why it's called Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. Badiou would use these mathematical axioms very rigorously, precisely, read them, and take out a philosophical implication from these axioms. We don't have the time, but I will briefly talk about two axioms. The first axiom, which is an axiom of extensionality, but okay, let me not go into that. Let me just first talk about a very fundamental axiom of set theory, which means every set has a null set as its element. So a so-called empty set, a set with no element, an empty set, would also have a null set in it. This is often, written as the singleton set. So there's a zero and there's a slant going upward the zero, cutting across the zero. That's how this set is often written. So it's important to understand that each element of a set is also a subset, and it has its own elements. So if there's a set called A, and if there is this element called 1 in that set A, the element is also a set. 1 is also a set. And 1 may have its own elements, X, Y, Z, right? So each element of a set is also a subset with its own elements. That's important to understand. Now, the famous notion of power set is something Badiou works his way through. So a power set means that if there is a set with some elements in it, there would have to be another set that counts the elements of this set. Okay, so this is the famous idea of the power set in Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, where there would have to be this sort of extensional logic. If there is a set with a certain series of elements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there would have to be another set which counts these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements as one in the form of another set. This is what Badiou calls the law of the count, or the law of the count as one. So the elements have to be counted as one. And to go back to this famous moment of Russell's paradox, the problem here, and set theory encounters many paradoxes, and it works its way through by axiomatizing some of these paradoxes. Axioms are formulas, let's call them formulas. So the famous paradox here is the one that counts all the elements also an element? And is that one counted as a one of element? Let's understand the subtlety here. There's a one of the count. There is an element that counts all the other elements. But is that counting element itself counted as one? So is the law of the count something that belongs to itself? This is a very important question for set theory that Badiou extrapolates physically, philosophically, and physically too. It's a material extraction. The idea is, can a pure multiple have a self-belonging? Can it belong to itself? Now, why is this question a paradox? Here we come to a very important second axiom of Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, called the axiom of foundation. And as the term itself suggests, we are talking about a very important axiom which in a way foundationalizes set theory, at least in its Zermelo-Fraenkel avatar. So axiom of foundation is slightly technical. I'll try and explain this as clearly as possible, but I would urge all of you to pay attention who's listening to this. So if there is one set, as I said, there would be elements in that set, and each of those elements would also be a subset with its own elements. Now, the axiom of foundation declares that if there is a set A, and if X is an element of that set A, X, which is also a subset with its own elements, will have at least one element that does not belong to the larger set A. It's a very important point to understand. So within A, there is element 1. In that element, which is also a set, there is one element, let's say P. P does not belong to the larger set A. So P is an element of one of the subsets of A, and yet P does not belong to the larger set A. This axiom of foundation is what Badiou dwells on to develop this idea that there is always an other in us. And this is, of course, coming from his own Lacanian lineage of psychoanalysis. There is always an other in us because there's a certain mark of foreignness or a mark of otherness or alterity in each set. So politically, we are talking about the set as a formation of human group, where a human collective is formed, a human community is formed. Now, let me now come to the question of the event in set theory. And let me begin with this very important point that we must keep in mind, that Badiou is not doing, at some level I would argue, Badiou is not doing philosophy of mathematics. In fact, very subtly, what he's doing is trying to pass through mathematics in order to reach a point where mathematical formalizations, like the axiomatic set theory of Zermelo-Fraenkel, or Grothendieck's topoi theory, category theory, which we will come to later, these formalizations cannot capture the real event of politics, which is an upsurge, a revolution, right? Mathematical formalizations are necessary to go through, but mathematics as such does not know the event. This is again a very important point to keep in mind. Mathematics does not know the revolutionary political event, even though we can go through the passage of mathematics to reach that point where mathematics fails to register the event. So the event is a failure of mathematical formalization to register the notion of the event as true political change. And this word true political change is important. I'll come back to this. So what is this event in relation to mathematics? Let me simplify this now. But the point you've already understood is that the self-belonging of a multiple is not a simple question. Because in a set, there is always an other who doesn't quite belong to the set. If there is at least one element which does not quite belong to the set, self-belonging becomes a problematic avatar. But this is the dimension that the event brings in. The event is like a site, a space. And again, it's interesting, Shaurik was talking about the museum, right? Museum as a site. This is a very spatial ontology too. It's a space that is generating this notion of being as appearing, which I would come to. But to first situate this idea of event in set theory, and to also claim that mathematics does not know the event, let's talk about this aspect first. So Badiou's idea, and again, let me now non-mathematically, talk about this for a while. What is an event? What is the politics of the event? So there is a situation, a real life situation, and Badiou often gives very specific, concrete examples, like the May 1968 student protests, Paris Commune in the French context. Also, the example that he's quite fond of, and he goes in detail to discuss this in Logics of Worlds at one point, is the Maoist revolution in China, the Red China phase, so to speak, the Cultural Revolution. So these are some of the examples he gives of a political event. But the point is to talk about the schema of the event now, right? So what is an event? In a situation, there is a particular point that Badiou calls the void. And this, of course, goes hand in hand with the axiom of the void in set theory. But for the time being, let's just talk about it without set theory for a while. There is a real life situation. There is a point where the void of that situation is located. What is this void? Again, we'll come back to this later, but there is a lack, let's say, or a void in that situation where something is very weakly present in that situation. One political example of this that Badiou himself gives in the second manifesto for philosophy is the proletariat. Okay, the proletariat as a void of the situation. I'll return to this when we come to Logics of Words. So there is a void in a situation, and the void is where the situation has an ontological principle. So the situation, the real life situation, relates to the being at that point of the void. It's at that point of the void where the link with the being of the situation lies. Now there's one multiple in that situation, like a set. That multiple is at the edge of the void. That's again very close to the void. Now this multiple suddenly encounters the situation and becomes quite a dominant element. This was very weak, by the way. This was very weak, and it was somehow, lying there, nestling there, not in any position of strength, but it raises its head, so to speak. This weak multiple at the edge of the void of a situation, from that ontological, moment in the situation, it raises its head. And this is the moment of the upsurge, when something happens. And what we have is the change of that situation into another situation. This is very important to understand that we are not talking about one fixed situation. We are talking about a dynamic movement of change from one situation to another situation, from a first situation to a second situation. In that second situation, this weak multiple becomes more powerful. In fact, it is around this weak multiple raising its head that the second situation comes into being and supplants the first situation, or replaces the first situation. So this is Badiou's ontological mapping of, as you can understand already, I suppose, a politics of change, a politics of true change, where a situation is not simply reorganized into the same situation. So we could have a set, right, where the set is not disorganized, the elements shuffle around, and the set in its larger organizational principle remains the same. This is not true change for Badiou. This is just a modification. And, electoral democracy for Badiou is this idea of modification. A modification that does not quite change the set. It does not replace the set with another set. It does not replace the situation with another situation. So what we have, and now I'm slowly making a move towards the second book, Logics of Worlds, is this idea of a world. And it's important that it's in the plural. It's not one world. It's multiple worlds. Every situation is like a world. And event will change the situation from the liminal point of one world to a maximal point in a second world where it becomes extremely important, right? So as you can understand, this is an idea of event as a cut, event as a point of discontinuity, not as a point of continuity, but as a point of discontinuity. So event is a discontinuation of a given structure. It's a rupture. Event is a rupture. So how does he think this through now in relation to category theory? As I've already said, Grothendieck's category theory is a theory of space. And it's in relation to this spatial matrix that Badiou talks about the event now. Now, you might be wondering, why does mathematics not know the event? A point that I did not elaborate upon, but a point that Badiou takes his pain to go through in being an event, as well as Logics of Worlds. Mathematics does not know the event because mathematics is the study of being. And being is supplanted by the event. The book is called Being an Event. There's a dialectic here. The dialectic suggests that being is dialectically displaced by event. Event is what displaces a being in a given real life situation, right? And through the event, we have the inauguration of a new situation, a new world, to use the language of the second book. Now, in this new world, what was inexistent, this is Badiou's word, what was inexistent in the first world now achieves a maximal degree of existence. So all the set theoretical ideas of the axiom of foundation, being as an encounter with the void of a situation, are very much intact. But mathematics cannot know this event not because the event does not happen in mathematics. The event happens in mathematics. But mathematics is not conscious of this event. And this is where philosophy comes in to make the unconscious conscious. And there is a very deep psychoanalytic implication of Badiou's move here. Badiou doesn't do this explicitly, but what he suggests implicitly in his work is that there is a psychoanalytic move where the unconscious of mathematics, which is the event, becomes conscious through the philosophical thinking through of mathematics. This is a philosopher, Alain Badiou, deriving certain philosophical implications from Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory or Grothendieck's topoi theory or category theory, right? Now, in Logics of Worlds, as he says, he's more interested in how a being appears in a world. So we are talking now about being in relation to appearing. I might have a being, but unless I appear in a concrete world, there is no being in a logical sense. There might be a pure being as multiplicity, but there is no logical appearing of that being. So this is what Badiou calls phenomenology, which is a very physical, corporeal appearing of the being in a world. Now, when we say world, I don't mean world as my life, and when I die, I exit this world. I'm talking about all the concrete social, political micro worlds that are created when we form some sort of a human chain, when there's a community formation. Think of any political demonstration. I mean, he often gives this example of, Republic, the Place du Republic in Paris, where we are talking about a demonstration. And of course, he's drawing back, he's going back to his own memories of a political activist, being a political activist during the May 1968 student protests. So he's talking about event in that sense, event as an upsurge, right? But now, again, to go back to the logical dimension of this, how does he show the event in relation to topos theory or category theory or greater logic? He's talking about, as I say, the logic of appearing, the appearing of a human being in some sort of a collective formation. So the set theoretical models are very much there. It's just looking at the same idea of the event from a different point of view, from the point of view of a body, from the point of view of a body where the event will happen and set forth a truth. Okay, so this is the idea of this sort of corporeal logic of appearing, how a being appears in the world. Now, again, we are going back to the same set theoretical idea. In a world, there are multiple beings. Each of these beings is a pure multiple, that is to say, a multiple of another multiple, and so on, ad infinitum. Now, in all these beings that populate a world and appear into a world, there is at least one being which has this minimal degree of appearance. This being is what he calls the inexistent. It does not mean that this being does not appear at all. It appears, but it has a minimal degree of appearance. This is the proletariat. I mean, in one, at least, manifestation of this is the proletariat. Now, Badiou is, engaging with a particular register of Marx's thought here. Let's pay attention to this because, of course, proletariat is a class. In India, proletariat is a class caste inflex, right? There's a certain proletarian being, which is economic, which is, in India, as I said, also a question of caste, because caste system is how labor is divided in India. And to sort of remember that famous moment from Ambedkar, it's also the moment of the division of laborer, not just the division of labor, but the division of laborer. So caste and class, as Ambedkar did, has to be, they have to be thought as one inflex. I'm deliberately not using the word complex, maybe inflex is a better word, because they kind of go into one another, saturate one another, become one another, and also deviate from one another at moments. But to come back to what we are talking about, in this idea of the proletariat, we are talking about the futuristic or the axiomatic idea of the proletariat. So this is not the proletariat as a working class. Of course, the proletariat as a working class in the classic Marxist imagination exists in society. But the point is, what is the nature of the proletariat in that very controversial idea of Marx's thinking, where he talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat? This has been seen as a contradiction. Why the word dictatorship? Why not a democracy of the proletariat? When the state withers away in classical Marxist political thought, there's this idea that the proletariat will take over and it will become a dictatorship of the proletariat. So to broach this question of contradiction, the point is, what is the proletariat? This Latinate term, which of course has ramifications of the working class, the laborers, and so on. So they are very much existing in the capitalist political structure. But in the capitalist bourgeois political structure, they don't have a maximal degree of appearance. They're there, but they're there as this weak singularity, what Badiou would call a weak singularity. Only when the event happens, and again, to reiterate, the event is a supplementation of one world into another through the liminal point of that first world. This liminal point is occupied by the proletarian being, let's say, which has this inexistent quality to it. It is inexistent because it appears minimally. Now, through category theory, Badiou shows, I know we are slowly running out of time, and I do want to come to literature and the literary instantiation of this. So I'll now finish this point about Badiou, that the inexistent erupts through the event, and we have the supplementation of one political situation with another. In what Badiou calls towards the latter half of Logics of Worlds, there are these multiple forms of political chains that he imagines, and he's using mathematics to axiomatize political change. But the key point is mathematics cannot fully register the political change of the event. The political charge of the event is something that mathematics thinks, but at one point, mathematics also fails to register the conceptual dimension of this change, because mathematics as thinking is something that, a thinker of mathematics does not have to be a philosopher. A mathematician can do that too. We have enough examples of that. So, but a thinker of mathematics will, create that space where mathematics will become thought. And that's the philosophical operation, which will become this unconscious or latent dimension of mathematics patent. And this is what Badiou is doing by axiomatizing change, political change, through the logic of the event, but at the same time saying that mathematics doesn't quite know the event. There is the inexistent in a situation, but when we talk about topos theory and the way category theory thinks about axiomatizing the inexistent, it doesn't quite talk about this alteration of one topos with another, where a new situation comes into being. And again, there are multiple other maneuvers I'm not going to go into, such as the generic, the idea of the generic, and how Badiou reads Cohen and Gödel together. Cohen and Gödel are two mathematicians of the notion of the generic set in Cohen and the notion of impossibility in Gödel. I wouldn't go into this. Let me now come to literature. Now, in a very fundamental sense, a literary text opens up a world. There is a world with beings populating that world, especially if we are talking about narrative literature, whether it's a short story or a novel, and sometimes in narrative poetry as well. I mean, any literary text conjures a world, constructs a world. There are logics through which that world gets ordained. There are logics through which that world is governed. There are elements in that world which form a set together, right? There's a collective formation we see in literary texts in the form of literary communities, right? It could be the simple thing of, 100 people in a train, and they form a contingent momentary community because they're all, journeying together. So community sets, in this sense, these sets are also literary themes of a collective, any kind of collective in a literary text. And Badiou himself reads quite a bit of literature in these books, by the way. He talks about Beckett, for example. He talks about Mallarmé and Mallarmé's famous poem, Coup de Dé, The Throw of the Dice. He talks about Hölderlin. He talks about Rousseau's novels, Valéry's poetry. So there's a lot of literary, let's say, machinery that you goes into while talking about the politics of the event as well. But I will now very briefly mention one short story by Nabarun Bhattacharya. And it's a short story I translated or retranslated recently for the Bloomsbury book that Shaurit and I and Shamrat Sengupta, another scholar of Nabarun, we are editing together. And this is a short story called 4+1. It was written in mid-90s. I'm not applying Badiou very simplistically to literature, but I'm trying to run through some of these ideas, with a literary text. I'm trying to run these ideas through this short story 4+1. And the reason is the short story has a mathematical rubric and it has a deeply political content, almost like a Kafka short story. So very briefly, it's a very simple story at some level. And it's written like a satirical journalistic reportage. As the title itself suggests, there's a mathematical question, 4+1. Okay, there's a simple addition there, 4+1. But does it give us a 5? That's a question. Does 4+1 give us a 5? Now, who are these 4 people and the +1? What is this +1? So we have this bizarre situation. It's a bizarre short story where in Kolkata, we have a tram that stops all of a sudden in the middle of its tracks because the tram driver pushes the brake. That's because there were 4 people with a dead body walking right into the tracks. So they just intersected the tracks from one side. And in the last moment, somehow, even though the tram driver braked the tram, there was this sort of accident that happened, and some of these people got hurt. Now, this is 1995, and the story goes into these sort of conspiracy theories of politics. So we have a set of things that have happened. We have in 92 we have the famous or infamous masjid demolition, and what we have after that is again, a set of riots that break out, as you know, in Bombay, right? There is the Bombay explosion. The whole Tada case is sort of very strong at this point. And the story references some of these things, questions of terrorism, and how Bollywood is also playing down some of these questions with films like 1942, A Love Story, and Roja. These films are mentioned in the short story. But there is a certain political climate of conspiracy and surveillance. So the entire police department get very active about this bizarre situation because it turns out after medical examination that the 4 people who were carrying the corpse of this 5th person, all these 4 people cannot talk, cannot see, and cannot hear. They have no faculties of listening, talking, and seeing. So these 4 people, how could they possibly be corpse carrier for this 5th person? Again, medical examinations completely fail to understand how this 5th person died. The 4 people are very much alive. Now, they cannot be tortured enough, and there cannot be any extraction of information because they cannot speak, cannot talk, and cannot listen, cannot hear. So because they do not have these basic abilities, you cannot extract information, however much you might torture them. They're all imprisoned, and this 5th person, no one has a clue how he died. It seems like multiple organs in his body are insulted. And the story uses this sort of medical jargon, insult. And at the end of the story, we are still in absolutely no man's land. Nobody knows anything about these 4 people. And how could this whole thing happen? The story from the very beginning creates this very strong eventual dimension. In the everyday reality of Kolkata, in this sort of tram track, one fine evening, this bizarre thing happens. 4 people who cannot see, cannot talk, cannot hear, are going to some, anonymous Shamshan Ghat with this corpse. And nobody has any idea who these people are. There's no identity information that can be extracted, even with, technological steps and so on. And the story ends with this sort of ludicrous point where this body is preserved by the government with a huge amount of expenditure just to see if in future dead bodies can be brought back to life through, cryoformation or anything. Again, there's a science fiction dimension in this moment of the story where, the journalistic reportage says that in future, if this body can be brought back to life, maybe something can be known about this strange event. Now, as I'm sure you would already understand, I'm trying to posit this event as this incalculable chance encounter that disrupts the everyday flow of events, which are not political events. Now, the interesting part is this event is not, traditionally speaking, a political event. But neither is Harbert Sarkar, for people who are aware of Nobarun's oeuvre in his famous novel Harbert Sarkar is not a traditional political subject. In fact, his politics comes out of his passion for his nephew, Binu, who is one of the Naxalite supporters and activists in the 70s. So, but to track back to 4+1, the political dimension of this event is quite clear. But the point I'm trying to make, and here I'm bringing in Baju, is the fact that Nobarun explicitly draws a mathematical topos for this by titling the story 4+1. But this is not enough. The story is divided into 4 parts. These 4 parts do not correspond to the 4 corpse bearers, right? They do not correspond. The story is, as it seems, sort of randomly distributed, but it's not random, of course. It's distributed into 4 parts. Now, the interesting question is, where is the 5th part? The situation and the set that we have is a set of 5 elements, right? 5 elements, 4+1. But this +1 is the corpse from which nothing can be extracted. No understanding of who it is, how it died, and so on. This corpse is the +1, or a kind of an inexistent of the situation. But at one level, the whole event with the set of 5 elements is an inexistent, because it happens against the tide of everyday life. All of a sudden, as I said, the tram driver is shocked out of his wits to see 4 people carrying a corpse coming into the tram track. So the important point is the story leads to a change of situation where this +1 of the corpse becomes the most coveted object. The state spends tons of money to preserve this dead body in hope that something would be known about this, because the climate is such. Tiger Menon and other terrorists are out in the open. The state has no idea, where these people are. So there are these topical references in the short story which generate a certain politics of, let's say terrorism. And that's why in the conspiracy theory, this event becomes a political event, even though it is not intrinsically a political event. It's a bizarre event, right? It's not political, but it becomes political in the eye of the state, which of course the story is satirizing. And we have that famous articulation from Harbert, which I would forge here, which is like a Bajuian schema of the event. The state machinery can never know when, how, and where the explosion will happen. And this references the famous explosion at the end of Harbert, when all these dynamite sticks, which were hidden in Harbert's body, finally explode after many, many years, when he's taken into the crematorium for the final rites. So death is a connecting trope between the event in Harbert and this event of corpse carrying and this accident that happens with the tram. But let me end with this final point, that this +1, which is the corpse, is the inexistent that becomes the center of attention, and with that we mutate into another situation. But what does not happen in Nobarun, and here we mark a departure from Baju, is that we do not necessarily have an egalitarian second situation where the proletariat rises and we have a second moment of change, of true change, where the inexistent becomes the centerpiece. Here, the inexistent corpse becomes the centerpiece of cognitive attention. but it does not quite lead to a political change. But what Nobarun underscores in this short story, I think, is how there is something to come. There is a future to come, and that's the +1. And I think it's not for nothing that he ends the story with the 4th section. He could have distributed this story into 5 sections because they do not correspond to the 5 elements, the 4 corpse carriers and the corpse. But he decides to finish the story with the 4th element, keeping this 1 in the offing. This is how Badiou famously discusses the future of the event in Logics of Worlds, where the event is like the 500th page of a book, which only has 499 pages. So there are only 499 pages in a book, but by the fact that there is that number 499, a 500 is suggested. So there's yet another page to come. Similarly, there's yet another section to come in this short story. And it ends with this very significant trope of waiting, where it says that the concerned authority is waiting for more information on these 4 people or about this corpse. Anyone who knows more about these things is asked or requested to come, and proffer that information. So that's why the story ends, with this infinite note of waiting for a future. But this future is also the 5th element of the set. And this is how I think Nobarun wonderfully underscores the inexistent to come. This is a prep for the event, I would say, not necessarily the event as such. Thank you. I'll finish there. We could take questions. Thank you for listening.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Thank you for such a wonderful, analysis, the way you explained everything. And I think your presentation, it left us, seeking for that hope, that 5th element, and the suddenness of events and, the absolute uncertainty of the turn of events and the results of them. So it was wonderful listening to you, sir. Without much further ado, I'll proceed with the Q&A session. So I'll request Mr. Das to conduct the session. Over to you, Mr. Das.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. I'm audible, right?
Yes, please go ahead.
Dr. Chattopadhyay, we have one question for you that is from Dr. Mohammad Siddiq. He is the headmaster at Masoudia Arabic High School. His question is it true that man uses philosophy and logic to save his life and honor?
Can you see that once more?
And love to sacrifice?
Sorry, can you see that once more, please? There was a moment of...
Sure. Is it true that man uses philosophy and logic to save his life and honor and love to sacrifice?
Oh, okay. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I was going in that direction, but it's interesting that this question is evoked by the talk. Yes, I would say, again, to go back to a very different discussion or to comments that, because I never talked about this, I think, as the saying goes, it's not a question of philosophy or no philosophy. Every person, every human being is a philosopher at some level, because every human being is a thinking subject. And there is a dimension of philosophy in that process of thinking itself, So there's a truism in philosophical circles which would say it's a question of good philosophy or bad philosophy, and not a question of philosophy or no philosophy. So yes, I suppose philosophy is a way of making sense of the world. This is something that is true for Badiou as well. Badiou is trying to make sense of the world where events happen, the world where incalculable, unpredictable events happen, and they dislodge the status quo of that world, or they generate another world, which is very important. And Badiou is also very careful not to slip this into some sort of a spiritual or religious dimension. This other world is very much a part of this world. So he uses the term transcendental from Immanuel Kant and develops this term in a mathematical sense and calls topoi theory the mathematics of transcendental. But what is this transcendental? It's very interesting that he uses this word, because transcendental in a religious sense could be another world, a metaphysical world. But there is no such metaphysical world for Badiou. He's an immanent materialist. He's someone who believes in the existence of multiple worlds within this world, but no spiritual higher realm before or after death. Right? So what we have here in the event is, in fact, this idea that you can change the world. What is the change of the world? It is the inception of a new world by, in a way, the inexistent of the previous world. So the inexistent that raises its head up and changes the world, and we have a different world coming into being through the inexistent. So that's the logic of appearing, which in a way, in this logic of appearing, being in an ontological sense also subverts appearing. Being subverts appearing and creates a new world, a new logic. Through that, again, that sort of foundation of axiom, axiom of foundation, where Badiou is, drawing attention to the fact that according to set theory, there's always this stranger in a community. There's always this outsider in a community. An outsider that cannot be counted by the law of the situation. So it is from this position of what cannot be counted by the law of the situation that a new situation, a new world can be brought forth. Love and sacrifice, I really don't know whether I can answer that question because it's completely outside the purview of what I was talking about. But thank you for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay. The next question is from Sana Tabasum, research scholar. She asks, how has philosophy lost its essence in the contemporary world?
Again, a very general and difficult question to answer. So, I think philosophy losing its essence says something about human culture in our 21st century reality. There's a certain push towards instrumentalization of thinking, which comes to a point of no thinking, if I may say this in a slightly provocative way. And that's the reason, I suppose, philosophy has lost its essence. But I don't think it has lost its essence. What it has lost is, a bit of its mojo, perhaps. I mean, philosophy has lost its mojo as a discipline in itself. In a very professional, pragmatic sense, I'm saying this. If you think of the philosophy departments, there are issues there are practical issues there. That's partially because philosophical thinking has sometimes also led itself onto this, kind of a quicksand where it has not been able to concretize itself in relation to the world. And that's where I think the efficacy of someone like Badiou's philosophy lies. He's incredibly dense and formalistic at one level, and he's incredibly pragmatic and worldly at another level. There's this, very interesting cohabitation of abstraction and concreteness in Badiou's philosophy, which I think comes from his mathematical training. Because this is one of those fundamental questions in mathematics. Where is mathematics? If we do a meta-mathematics, what, the set theorists called Bourbaki would call meta-mathematics. Meta-mathematics is thinking about mathematics. Now, the irony is the moment you're thinking about mathematics, you're outside mathematics. And at some level, you are in the domain of philosophy. You are philosophizing mathematics. So what Badiou does, I think, is to co-invoke this abstraction as well as the concreteness of mathematics. Mathematics at one level is all about abstraction. It depends on the human ability to abstractivate things, to make things abstract by, I'm also using the word as a verb. abstractivation, to use the word as Adorno would use it, abstractivation, not necessarily abstraction as a noun, but abstraction as a verb, right? But what Badiou also does is to, incredibly concretize these discussions. So I didn't get the time, but for those of you who are interested, I think it will be advisable to read the way he reads particular events in history as these moments of disruption. But the subtlety of the argument is that the event is not historical. The event is lodged in history as a disruption in the historical, flow of ordinary events. It's like that extraordinary set. There's this idea of extraordinary set in a logician that you invokes. So I think that's how I would perhaps respond to that question. I think philosophy has to connect itself with reality, with the material groundings of our lived worlds. And that way, if it does that, and that's one of the philosophical implications of Badiou's program, it will not have lost its essence, to put it in that future anterior. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay. The next question is from Nilanjan Chakraborty, assistant professor. He asks, are events located in here and now for the being to exist in the world of literature?
Can you see that once more, please? That's a difficult question. Yeah.
Sure. Are events located in here and now for the being to exist in the world of literature?
I'm still not sure about the question because syntactically that's an unfinished sentence, right? So I'm not quite sure what the speaker or what the person means here. Sorry to put you through this. Could you please say that once more? I'll try and respond to it at least.
Sure. He says, are events located in here and now for the being to exist in the world of literature?
Okay, so let me respond to it like this. What is the event in literature? Isn't literature an event in itself? This is something that someone like Terry Eagleton, another Marxist critic of an Althusserian bent, has discussed at some length, but not with reference to Badiou. He has mentioned Badiou in that book, but he has a book called Event of Literature, which, if you're interested, you could read. So there is a certain idea of literature as an event, not just in the production. Of course, literature as a commodity is a production, and there is an event there. But again, I'm not necessarily talking about that idea of literature as a capitalist product. Of course, it is. There's no denying that. It's like any other commodity, a commodity which has its use value and its exchange value. But the point is, how do we think the event in literature? It's interesting that you asked this question and addressing the person who asked this question because, that's a part I could have developed more, but didn't get the time to because, as you can understand, developing on Badiou's system, which is quite a complex and dense mathematical system, one has to be technical and at the same time try and make sense. So I didn't get a lot of time to talk about literature in relation to the question of the event. So I would simply say any literary text, as I said, is a world. But the question is, how is that world mutated? Is the mutated world in the literary text, or is it simply inaugurated by the literary text in the psyche of the reader, and it's for the reader to imagine the afterlife of that literary text? So what we have in Nobarun, to continue with that example, it's striking, right, that the last chapter of Harbert is written in future tense. And that question of futurity is very important. The novel does not end with that crematorium explosion. It ends with the last chapter where we see Harbert's remains, the remains from, not his mortal remains, but the remains from his room, all the little things he played with, and Harbert is someone who did planchette, someone who, brought in ghosts and almost made necromancy into a profession. So in Harbert, what we have here is this, last chapter where all the, elements or all the remnants of Harbert's room, they are sold away or given away to people. And we see an afterlife of the subject, how Herbert as a subject can come back through those events. So these are the eventual possibilities that a literary text often marks. And without generalizing, I would say that sometimes the event lies in that time after you finish reading the book and close the book. As a digital object, maybe you close the monitor, or you slide back the phone, or you slide down your laptop, whatever be it, the digital object or the old analog idea of a book. When you close the book, you're left with eventual possibilities. The idea of thinking about literature as an event is also to think how literature, through its reading practice, can give birth to new subjects. Now, whether we can mathematize this idea of literature, where a literary practice of reading will generate new worlds that supplement the world of that literary text. So the fifth part of Nobarun's short story, 4+1, is not written. It's not given. It's not there in the state of the situation, to use that Badiouian language. In fact, it is to come. To co-invoke Badiou and Derrida here, it's like avenir, the future. But the future and the to come in Derrida are not exactly the same. There is a to come, a l'avenir, a future to come. This to come is not exactly the future imagined by a statist apparatus of imagination. So that's where literature perhaps can prepare us for an event of the subject where we, as readers of literature, can change truly through that practice of reading. That's where I'll stop responding to that very interesting question. Thank you.
One moment, we'll just continue with the session. There's some disruption. Please wait, sir.
Sure, no problem. There should be some disruption in a talk. There is so much about disruption, right? So it's not a problem at all. Please go ahead.
So am I audible now? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now, I guess. Yeah, please go ahead.
So the final question is from Dr. Padmalochan Raut. He asks whether philosophy is the mother of literature.
Philosophy is the mother of literature? Is that the question? Right. Okay.
That is the question.
Right. This is again a very interesting idea. So if we say philosophy is the mother of literature, we are giving philosophy some sort of an importance where philosophy becomes the origins of literature. Again, there might be a critique of that position coming in from Badiou's idea, where philosophy, as I said, does not have a truth of its own. Philosophy maneuvers the truths that are political, scientific, mathematical, that is to say in this case, amorous, and also artistic. So these are the four truth processes, and philosophy is like an event management organizer. Not really, I'm just joking. It's not really managing events, but at some level, philosophy would try and extrapolate the event from these, four conditions, which have the event in them, but they may not know it. So when it comes to literature, again, if we think of philosophy as the mother of literature, there's no harm in that. Philosophy might as well be the mother of literature when we are thinking of it in a larger sense, in a non-Badiouian sense. But I think when we are talking about Badiou's system, that would be tantamount to saying philosophy and literature or philosophy and art are sutured. Badiou's project is to de-suture philosophy from each of these conditions and have them as four discrete conditions for philosophy. That's why I use that mathematical word which Badiou himself uses, transversal. Let's say they are parallel lines. lines, art, mathematics, art, let's say literature here. So literature, mathematics, politics, and love. These are, in a way, parallel lines. And philosophy is like that point, if you're thinking of, again, mathematically, a projective plane. On a projective plane, all these lines would meet at the point of infinity. What we know from the ancient Desargues theorem. So parallel lines meet at that point of infinity. So philosophy is like that projective infinity, that projective point in the infinity, where these four tracks, would somewhere meet. That's the plus one. Again, to go back to the language of Nobarun's story, philosophy is the corpse. It's the plus one, where these four corpse bearers and their project of taking this man to a Shamshan Ghat would reach some sort of a climax. But interestingly, that climax is never to be reached, just like that projective point of infinity, where parallel lines are theoretically meant to intersect. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay, for your responses. We have now ended the question answer session. So over to you, Professor Chakraborty.
If I may, she may not be in the call. She might have got dropped out, I think.
No, sir, I'm still there.
Oh, okay, great.
So that was one. That was wonderful. Thank you for responding to all the questions, for your patience and your elaboration on each and every point. With this, I'll move on to the valedictory session, and I invite Dr. Bishadit Ray for giving us the valedictory lecture. Dr. Ray, over to you.
Am I audible? Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir. You're audible. You're perfectly audible.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm privileged enough. It is a privilege to be asked to conclude this wonderful international web lecture series, that is Confluence 2020, organized by the Department of English, Piyush Kanti Mukherjee Mahavidyalaya. First of all, I thank Dr. Dept Mukhopadhyay, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Coach Bihar Panchanan Burma University, West Bengal, and our chief guest for gracing the web lecture series with his august presence and for truly encouraging us on our maiden attempt to organize a webinar of this kind. I would like to also thank Mr. Arnav Bandyopadhyay, our respected teacher in charge and HOD Sanskrit, for his constant support and encouragement. The webinar has been truly instrumental in making a mark in the current academic discourse of humanities, which would have been impossible without our esteemed speakers. Therefore, on behalf of our college, Piyush Kanti Mukherjee Mahavidyalaya, I thank Ms. Ivy Rai Sarkar, Senior Research Scholar, IIT Roorkee, for her insightful deliberation on Northeast India with special reference to Naga literature. We sincerely hope that her talk on the literary as well as the sociological aspects of the people of northeastern region of India will inspire new researchers. I thank Ms. Nobonita Rakshit, Senior Research Scholar, IIT Roorkee, for her lecture on the importance of climate change and its reflection in literature, and how literature becomes a potent tool for addressing issues like environmental crises, migrancy, as well as the evils of modernization. On our second day, we had a very invigorating lecture by Nandini Maiti, Assistant Professor and HOD English, AKW College, Bankura University, on comics literature and transhumance. The questions of ethics, class, and gender raised by her are seminal to understanding of literature in general and comics studies in particular. I thank her for her lecture. The lecture of Dr. Arnab Kumar Singh, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Cultural Studies, University of Burdwan, was truly instrumental in opening new research perspectives in forms of archive studies, diaspora studies, as well as indenture narratives as well. I thank him for sharing his ideas with us. Dr. Shaurit Bhattacharya, lecturer, post-colonial studies, University of Glasgow. I thank you deeply for gracing us with your presence and most importantly, for introducing us to Laila Abu Laila, the Scottish Sudanese author, and once again referencing the discussion on post-colonial studies and interrelationship between museum and colonialism. We sincerely wish that your lecture inspire the new researcher. My deep regards and thanks to Dr. Orko Chattopadhyay, Assistant Professor, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Gandhinagar. His talks introduced us to the contemporary French philosopher Alain Badiou's mathematical ontology by going into his ideas on mathematics as a form of philosophical ideas and thinking, and taught us the unique possibilities of reading mathematics as a philosophy. The proposition of his talk were so unique that it left us all in a sense of wonderment. Thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay. I would also like to thank Mr. Alip Noor Ahmed, Assistant Professor and HOD Bengali of Piyush Kanti Mukherjee Mahavidyalaya, for giving us the idea of organizing webinars at our institution. I thank Mr. Shoumik Shil for the wonderful poster designs and Mr. Arman Dash for his kind help and support. Thank you, Mr. Dash, for conducting the question answer session. I thank Mr. Shubhashish Dotto, who has been sincere enough to provide us with the technical know-how and for being with us throughout. I thank our entire family of Piyush Kanti Mukherjee Mahavidyalaya for their constant support and encouragement. Lastly, but not the least, I would like to thank Ms. Purba Chakraborty, Assistant Professor and HOD English, for organizing and hosting such a wonderful lecture series and for bringing such esteemed speakers from around the world, enabling us to the showered with their expertise, which have left us seeking new avenues of knowledge. Thank you all once again. On the verge of our session, now I would like to request Ms. Purba Chakraborty, the convener of the web lecture series, to conclude the seminar, webinar lecture series officially. Over to you, Purba Chakraborty.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your vote of thanks. At the very end of our lecture series, we are at the very end, and it's a mixed feeling. I mean, I end it with a note of happiness, as well as I'm a bit sad that this interaction is coming to an end, but I think all good things has to end. So at the end, I would like to thank all the speakers who have been kind enough to respond to my invitation and to give us their precious time. I thank you all. And I thank all our dear participants who have been there all throughout for the wonderful questions, for their patience. Thank you. And on a very personal note, I would like to thank Mrs. Namrata Das and Mr. Partho Sharathi Das for their kind support and constant encouragement. With this, I end our web lecture series, Confluence 2020. Good night and thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.